Okay, so next slide, please. Oh, here's a good one. This is one we should all memorize. Be devoted to one another in love. So it's not good enough to just be devoted, right? Because you could be devoted in just a weird, you could be a stalker, you know, be stalking each other. Okay, it's devoted in love. Right? Joyful. One little joy, one little kindness, peace, patience, long-suffering. Come on. Honor one another above yourselves. How many would like to be in a group where they honor one another above themselves? Anybody here? Amen. That'd be a good group to be in, isn't it? Right? So that's what we have to learn to do. It's the next thing. So now what we do is God has this interesting plan, because our job is to make disciples of all nations, right? So how do you make disciples? Well, God has sort of a plan for making disciples. It's called as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So how do you sharpen another person as iron on iron? You bang together, don't you? Right? And is banging together nice and pleasant? No. How many people are not going to church today because they don't like banging together? When that's part of the plan's for you to bang together. Yeah, I knew I shouldn't give you toys. Two toys. Okay, yeah. Next one, please. Oh yeah, here's the baby porcupine, as I promised. So the lesson of the porcupine was this, is that the baby porcupines, you know, it was a late spring snowstorm. You know, the porcupines are born in, you know, animals are all born in the spring. And so the porcupines tried to huddle together to keep warm, right? It's nice to huddle together to keep warm, right? Problem is when everyone you're huddling together with is a porcupine, that gets a little uncomfortable, doesn't it? Because when you get too close to people, you start pricking each other, or poking each other, right? And you don't even know you're doing it because you're just being a porcupine, right? You're not like going, why is that other person saying ow all the time? You're just being yourself, right? So the lesson of the baby porcupines is they started poking each other, and they decided they didn't want to hang out with each other, did they? So they all went off in their separate things in the snowstorm, and they started freezing to death. Because it's like a fire, right? If you take all the sticks out of a fire, the fire goes out, right? So when the porcupines all went by themselves, they started freezing to death. So they had to learn to be together and endure the little pokes that they got from each other to be able to remain alive. What happens to Christians when they separate themselves from a church? Okay, I've been a pastor. I pastored my first church in 1983. So I've had a little bit of an opportunity to watch what happens to Christians when they decide to go off by themselves. Not very pretty. And even if they survive, which they often don't, they don't grow. Because how do you grow? You actually grow when you're irritated by your fellow Christian. Did you know that? When you get irritated, that's the growth process, right? Because you would not have to be faithful and long-suffering if there wasn't some faithfulness and long-suffering that needed to be done. Okay, so let's go. Next slide. Okay. Skip that one. Okay, so now, here, let's take our shell rock. Let's hold it in our hands. And this rock is actually, I think, called riprap. It's like little riprap. And it's like that because it has all kinds of sharp, uncomfortable edges on it. And if I didn't care about my insurance company, I'd have you scrape the person next to you with it. And then they'd go, yeah, don't do that. That hurts, right? Because that rock has sharp edges on it. Okay, next slide. Other way. Okay. Now, put the rock in the river,
I get it. It gets wet.
when you put the rock in the river, what happens? That rock starts rolling down with all the other rocks, and it starts chipping away at the other rocks, right? And everybody gets, all the rocks are irritated, right? Because it's owie, 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 all the way down the river, right?
Good word.
Okay, isn't that true? Isn't that the way it rolls? But then, after the rocks roll down the river for a while, they start looking like this, all smooth and nice and pretty, right? How many of you, when you first heard about the river, you go, man, I want to jump in the river? I think at one point that was our motto. We were like, jump in the river, come to River Rock and jump in the river. And everyone's like, woohoo, we want to be in the river of God. Yeah, and then you jumped in and you're like rolling down the river going, oh, this is fun, yeah, whoa, right? Isn't that the way it is? But in the river, you started, God started making you beautiful.
Yeah, dog. Yeah. Come on.
Yeah? Turn to your neighbor and say, you are beautiful. And turn to your other neighbor and say, you're beautiful too. That's right. We became beautiful because we were all a bunch of old rough rocks. I know some of you are going, gosh, some of you still look a little rough. It's okay. Because in the spirit, you're beautiful, right? Because God makes you beautiful by putting you in a box in the river and rolling you down the river. That's how you get beautiful. That's God's plan.
Ever.
So when you want to leave church or not come because somebody at church is making you irritable, you just say, oh, that's God's plan to make me even more beautiful than I am. We're impossible.
Yeah, not this. Help me, Jesus.
Okay? And then eventually, and I didn't have time to get this, but eventually you become polished rocks. And it goes even to the next. So you roll in the river long enough, and you become a polished rock, and you become a gem. But if you go down to the Truckee River, you know, many of you, I've heard my sermons about the dog that God gave me and how I would go down to the river, and that dog, and by the way, that dog is still teaching us lessons, isn't he, honey? Because we were off to my wife's mother's graveside service, and my dog decided to run away. And we would have just let him run away, except that we're a little nervous because where Wendy's parents live, they have miniature horses and the little pot-bellied pigs, and Lobo is a little Lobo. So we got to spend about a half an hour hunting our dog down and having patience and kindness and long suffering, right? But now my wife and I are even more beautiful because we tumbled with Lobo. Right? So what's the number one thing that keeps people out of churches? They're offended. Yes. I'm telling you, I just have about 3 different, I get a lot of emails just like you do. I must have had 3 different emails in the last week from pastors about how people get offended. Have you ever noticed how people are proud when they're offended? I'm so offended. And I look at them like, are you proud of this? Like you really worked, you took offense 101 and you really worked offense 102, so you're really good at getting offended and you're proud of how offended you get? Is that where you're going with this? Right? You know what I'm saying? That's why I love this picture. I've used it in other sermons. And it's just my favorite. I mean, you just look at that guy. He just looks like he is so proud that he's offended that he just wants the whole world to know. So he made a sign and just stood there saying, I'm offended. Okay? No, there's nothing to be prideful about in being offended. What we need to be looking for is how we can tumble down the river with each other and come out being full of love and patience and kindness and long-suffering and be together so our body is whole.
Amen.
We need, if you're going to be proud about anything, by all means come to me and you go, you know, Pastor, 17 people offended me at River Rock in the last week, but I am still here. Now, I will excuse you if you're proud of that. Right? Because that's real. You should be, because that's tough. You know? But that's what happens in the river, is God takes rough people like me. Now, where could we go with this now? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we're fools for Christ. You know, I often wonder why God chose me and brought me to Him in a vision at a Grateful Dead concert. And I really think it's because I am a fool for Christ. In other words, I'm a person who's just willing to believe God and to go with what He says. Right? And so that's how I became a Christian, I think. Because God looked down and said, that guy's a fool. I think I'll bring him into the kingdom. I really do. Now the only problem is I think many of you got in the kingdom the same way. Right? We're all fools for Christ. Right? And so He takes all these really rough, jagged, you know. I mean, I went from having long hair and a beard to now I have no hair, you know. I mean, I was doing it different than somebody else, right? But He took me and He took you and He dropped us in the river and He washes us down to the river until we turn into something that He can use.
Amen. Come on.
All right. So, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves, and we're going to really enjoy rolling down the river together.